Holy fucking shit, this video took forever to make. If you're confused as to why the guy who made 2 Elder Scrolls shitposts that somehow became viral is posting an hour-long video about an anime that nobody cares about, it's because I'm a human being that has more than one interest. I foreshadowed this video at the end of the Angel Beats video as a sort of way to show that I'm not a super negative person, and that I have things that I actually really like. 2 goddamn years later, I'm still not certain if I properly covered everything. This video was a nightmare to make because, as it turns out, it's way harder to properly convey why I love something that's very personal to me than to shit on one anime that I thought was overrated. We truly live in a society. But that's enough. Here's the actual video. It's a long one, and I genuinely hope that you stick through it, because I worked really hard on this. Thank you. If you've consumed as much media as I have, then eventually you get to a point where you stop enjoying fiction for what it is, and instead try to analyze every single detail. At some point, you start noticing tropes, and become immune to their effects. This happens with everything, with movies, TV shows, video games, and especially with anime. You become a critic. You no longer get any enjoyment out of simply consuming art. You consume it with the intention of tearing it apart. This is a sentiment that I get from a lot of people, and it's something that has happened to me many times. Sometimes you can't bring yourself to be inspired by art anymore, and it's a sad revelation. But once you see the brighter side of things, you realize it's not permanent. Because no matter how deep into the critic rabbit hole you end up, there are some works of art that you stumble across that for some reason you just happen to enjoy just because. I admire those moments because they remind me that I'm human. There are moments where you love a piece of art and somehow manage to ignore any flaws that it has. Perhaps they remind you of your childhood or previous experiences. Perhaps their characters or themes resonate with you so much that you end up viewing said piece of media as an extension of yourself. I've felt that before, and many of you probably have as well. And for me, there's no work of art that I felt this more than with the anime Sakurasou no Pet Kanojo. Back in 2016, I went on a huge anime rom-com bender. I'd watched Toradora for the first time about a year prior, and I fell in love with it. I loved the characters, the themes, the emotions behind it. It was an incredible experience, and it's still an anime that I love to this day. After which, I then decided to watch almost every single romance anime in existence. At one point, I had watched Oregairu, Hyoka, and Nagi no Asakara all in the same month. And though I love all of those anime, Nagi no Asakara I was a bit more mixed on, I still have some problems with it, none of them really ended up coming close to Toradora in my eyes. But then I came across Sakurasou, and though it didn't give me an experience similar to Toradora, instead it gave me a completely different experience that somehow ended up completely surpassing it. At its heart, Sakurasou is a story about purpose and working hard to achieve your own dreams. It highlights the struggles of someone who is surrounded by extraordinary talent while having no talent themselves. How can I hope to succeed in such a competitive world? Can I truly hope to become great with hard work alone when the people around me succeed with less effort simply due to how naturally talented they are? Not only that, but this anime also has subtle themes on disability and individualism as well, which I'll talk about later. The way Sakurasou explores these themes makes it stand out among all other high school romance anime. And to be frank, I don't really consider this anime to be much of a romance at all. It has romance elements, of course. I mean, there are 2 pretty major romantic side plots after all, but they're not the focus. If I were to more accurately describe it, I'd say that Sakurasou is more of a character-driven drama. Its characters and themes are its main strength. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that Sakurasou is probably the work of fiction that I relate to the most. Almost everything about it is so relevant and relatable to my own life and experiences. This anime has almost everything I love and look for in a story. It's funny, engaging, soul-crushing, and heartwarming all at the same time. It made me happy, it made me angry, it made me sad, it made me laugh, it made me cry. Its style and visuals are top-notch. Its characters are deep and lovable. Its themes are layered. The emotions. My god, the emotions! I rarely cry while watching anime. I don't know why, I'm just a heartless bastard, I guess. I mean, why else would I make a 32-minute video shitting on Angel Beats? But the final 4 episodes of Sakurasou have literally never failed to make me cry. Once. And this show is corny as hell, but that is exactly what I love about it. So why then? Why the hell do I love this anime so much? Why do so few people talk about it, and why does it so frequently slip under the radar? What about it resonates so strongly with me, to the point where this has become the most difficult video for me to write? And what the hell am I even talking about when I say that it's a single work of fiction that I relate to the most? Although it's an incredibly close second, and the gap is closing more and more every single day, it's not even my #1 favorite anime of all time. K-on's my favorite anime, and probably will be for the rest of time. So what about it makes it so special? And most importantly, why do I think Sakurasou no Pet no Kanojo is an underrated masterpiece? Well, I think it all boils down to colors. This anime has one of the most solid casts of main characters I have ever seen. Every single character in the show is so incredibly lovable, distinct, and deep with their own personal goals and struggles. The main character, Sorata, is one of the best character foils I've seen in anime. He very much fulfills the only sane man trope, as well as play a damn good straight man in comedic scenes. He's so average that it might even be reflected in his name. Kanda Sorata, kinda sorta. God, I hope that's intentional, because that's actually genius naming right there. While it's incredibly common for anime protagonists to appear so painfully average, Sorata's averageness manages to be incredibly important to the show's plot and themes. He has to be average in order to truly highlight just how not average the average Sakurasou resident is on average. Okay, that made absolutely no sense, but I think you get what I mean. He's an incredible foil, meant to bring out the best and most important qualities of the other main characters. But with all that being said, despite Sorata unmistakably being a well-written character, he is by far my least favorite main character in the entire cast. And there are a few reasons why, which I think I'll talk more about later. Suffice to say, while he's a great character, I don't think he's a particularly great person. And there are some moments, especially in the middle part of the story, where he really gets on my nerves. On the other hand, compare that to Misaki Kamigusa, who might be the best representation for what Sakurasou represents as a whole. Not only is she the first Sakurasou resident chronologically, but she's also the first character we're introduced to other than Sorata. I think this was a very deliberate choice, as Misaki most accurately represents what the residents of Sakurasou are like and what they're all about. Other characters describe her as an alien, being Sakurasou's most outwardly eccentric member, and someone who completely disregards all common sense, yet is also well known as an exceptionally smart and skilled animator. I absolutely adore Misaki's incredible enthusiasm and positivity. I wish there were more people like her in the world. If I were to most accurately describe Misaki and her role in the story, then I'd say she's the anime's most effective tone setter. She's such an attention-grabbing, larger-than-life character that she manages to completely dictate the mood and tone of the scenes that she's in. Not only does she control the tone of the scene comedically, in fact she's the closest thing to this anime's premier comic relief character, but she controls the tone narratively and thematically as well. Despite how enthusiastic and over-the-top she is, she's not a one-note character. In fact, I feel a lot of people tend to miss just how much of a multi-layered character she really is. Yes, she's incredibly bright and cheery most of the time, but not all the time. Because she is so positive most of the time, I think that makes the moments where she's not all the more important and impactful. Despite her eccentric nature, she's honestly an incredibly human character, which I think is a trend you're going to be seeing a lot in this show. I think both Misaki and Jin are absolutely the two most underrated characters in this show. Oh yeah, speaking of, there's also Jin Mitaka. Jin is such a well-written and important character. He's basically the Chad of the group. He's depicted as a philanderer and playboy, but ironically he's also incredibly grounded and down-to-earth, similar in a way to Sylvain from Fire Emblem Three Houses. I also love him because he's a fellow wannabe screenwriter like me. He's one of the more normal members of Sakurasou, which definitely plays a big part in his character and its overall impact on the story. In terms of the role he takes in the story, he definitely acts like a big brother to Sorata, as there are a lot of incredibly important heart-to-heart conversations and emotional confrontations between the two throughout the story. He's also an evil genius, and I absolutely love it. Aside from one other character I'll talk about later, Jin is very good at seeing through bullshit and calling out other characters. Because he's so grounded and down to earth, he's able to see through the facades many other characters put on, especially Sorata. In fact, very early on, Jin directly calls out Sorata on his hypocrisy for saying he wants to leave Sakurasou despite not making much of an effort to do so. Because of this, Jin is one of the first characters who makes Sorata call into question what his own goals are. There are many other reasons why I think Jin is such an underrated character, such as his relationship with Misaki, which I think is one of the most underrated and unfairly criticized parts of the anime, which I'll be talking about later. There's also his character flaws that the anime acknowledges and becomes a huge part of his character development later on. Counting the other Sakurasou residents, there's also Nanami Aoyama, who doesn't join until episode 5. She's Sorata's classmate and probably the most normal resident of Sakurasou, aside from Sorata. She's an aspiring voice actress and is very much established early on as an incredibly stubborn hard worker. I honestly think she's a better representation of a character working hard to achieve their goals only to be slapped in the face with the reality than the main character himself. Oh yeah, and it's incredibly obvious that she's in love with Sorata. And of course, he's completely oblivious to this fact because he's an anime protagonist. I honestly think this is one of the weaker parts of the show. I'll likely elaborate more on this later, but suffice to say this is one of the few times where a girl in an anime love triangle ends up losing due to her own poor decisions, rather than it purely being due to the first girl always wins trope. Though I will admit that is very much at play here. Next, there's Ryunosuke Akasuka, who is an inconspicuous yet also incredibly important character that often slips under the radar. He's a professional programmer and is immediately established as a shut-in. In fact, we don't even see what he looks like for the first 9 episodes, as he's always in his room and usually communicates via text or with his messenger AI named Mei-chan. And yeah, it's kinda weird at first, but you eventually get used to it. Ryunosuke is an interesting character, as he's often a character that slips into the background, but becomes incredibly important at certain points of the story. Early on, he is the one Sorata consults first when considering pursuing a career in game design, as Ryunosuke has experience in the field. He also lends him programming books, which further encourages Sorata's decision to become a game designer. What's immediately apparent about Ryunosuke, and probably his most important character trait, is his brutal honesty and logical mindset. He never sugarcoats things, and likewise acts incredibly cold and cynical towards others, which is one of the main reasons for his isolationism. He makes it incredibly clear that people irritate him, and that he has no interest in making friends. Because of this, a lot of people tend to compare him to Hachiman Hikigaya. Because of this, a lot of people tend to compare him to Hachiman Hikigaya from Oregairu. And yeah, that's a fair comparison. I think the main difference is that Ryunosuke is more so apathetic towards social interaction, whereas 8-Man views it with actual contempt. So in this sense, Ryunosuke is a realist, and 8-Man is a full-on pessimist. Although Ryunosuke isn't as much of an incel as 8-Man, though then again he literally says that he hates women.
僕はこの世に存在する大概のことには興味がない。それに女は嫌いだ。話しかけるな。
Oh, he just like me. He just like me for real.
So because of this outlook, he's easily the best when it comes to calling out other characters for their hypocrisy, more so than Jin. In fact, I say his primary role is to be a metaphorical counterweight to characters like Sorata by destroying them with
facts and logic.
Of course, there are times later on where his criticisms can become a bit disingenuous, which I think is very much intentional. I think Ryunosuke as a character is at his strongest when he acknowledges and calls out other characters who begin to act irrationally, which in an anime like this is fairly common. A lot of times, his words act as a catalyst for other characters to act or to self-reflect on their own biases, which is incredibly important. But of course, he himself has biases of his own, and does in fact go through quite a bit of growth throughout the series, especially with his interactions with Rita, which is a character and relationship I'll also be talking about later. I'm sorry, I need to be moving this section along. So of course, last but not least for our main cast, we have the anime's semi-titular main heroine, and my favorite main character, Mashiro Shiina. There's just so much to talk about with Mashiro that I'll be going into much greater detail about her later in the video. But suffice to say, Mashiro is the most important character in this entire show. Without her, the themes that make this anime work would simply be absent. Early on, it's established that Mashiro previously lived in England and moved to Japan to pursue a career in manga. Before, she was a world-famous artist and painter, but gained an interest in manga and transferred to Suime as an art student. It's very much apparent that Mashiro is an art prodigy, with a perfect photographic memory and unsurpassed technical skill, a true artistic genius. However, due to a life of isolation, art is literally the only thing she knows and understands. On top of that, she never had any friends either, aside from Rita, with whom she was close to at a young age. Like I said before, there's much more to Mashiro which I'll touch on later. So instead of talking at length about Mashiro's personality and her role in the story, I'm actually going to talk about one of my favorite scenes in the entire anime, the scene where she's first introduced. So about halfway into episode 1, Sorata is tasked by his teacher Chihiro-sensei to pick up her cousin who's recently transferred and is going to start living in Sakurasou. Sorata asks Chihiro why she's living in Sakurasou, questioning if it'll hurt her education, but Chihiro dodges the question and simply gives him a photo. Now this is something that I never noticed in my first viewing, and is probably something not many people have noticed or pointed out, but the photo she gives him is really old, like about a decade old. This may seem like a fairly insignificant detail, but it's actually incredibly important and says a lot about Mashiro and her upbringing. Why is this the only photo of Mashiro available? Why does she not have any more recent photos such as family photos or portraits? Why this one specifically? Well, this question is never answered directly, but what I think is meant to be implied is that there are no recent photos of her, other than the photos of her and her artworks, in which she's clearly not meant to be the focus of. Or at least, there aren't any other photos that Chihiro happens to own. While that might be a much more simple explanation, I think the fact that this is the only photo available is very much intentional, and is meant to foreshadow Mashiro's past. So anyway, after school, Sorata makes his way to the train station, in which he happens to run into some people he knows. They ask him why he decided to continue to attend Suime instead of moving with his family to Fukuoka, to which Sorata doesn't really respond. And the scene then cuts to him sitting on a bench under a cherry blossom tree at the train station. The scene is baked in the beautiful contrasting dust colors, as well as the pink of the falling sakura petals. He briefly thinks about the previous conversation, and admits to himself that he never really thought about why he decided to stay. A sakura petal falls onto his croquette, but before he takes it off, the wind blows it away, and when he looks in the direction that it flew, he sees a blonde-haired girl sitting on the bench across from him, caked in a bright sakura-colored light. He immediately recognizes her as the girl that he's looking for, and so he quickly gets up and walks towards her, not before finishing his croquette beforehand. He stands in front of her, hesitating to say anything while trying to avoid eye contact, but then, she speaks. It's hard for me to put my feelings of the scene into words. There's very little dialogue, and this first exchange between Sorata and Mashiro is incredibly short, but what is said somehow manages to be incredibly profound. It's unclear what Mashiro meant when she asks, but Sorata's response and the resulting exchange tells us a lot about these characters. Sorata says that he doesn't know what he wants to be, but says that right now he's probably iridescent. Though that's not really a color, it's a state of something that gradually changes color if looked at different angles. It's vague, and it describes Sorata perfectly, as at the moment he's non-committal and unsure of his future and what he wants out of life. Mashiro then says that she's white-colored, which not only reflects her name, which literally means pure white, but could also mean that she's metaphorically bright or shining. The thing about white is that it may or may not be considered a color depending on who you ask. It could be seen as the absence of color, but could also be seen as the presence of all colors. In a way, it also describes Mashiro perfectly, as she may seem blank or colorless, but she's actually incredibly colorful if you look deeper, shining more brightly than any other color. Mashiro comes off as blank and emotionless, but the thing about her is that she's just as capable of feeling emotions as any other person. She has her own goals, dreams, and hardships, but she doesn't know how to properly express her own emotions. Now this is something that I've been putting off mentioning, and it may very well just be headcanon, but me and a lot of other fans of the show agree that it appears to be heavily implied that Mashiro is autistic. She displays a ton of very common traits that are generally associated with or attributed to autism. She rarely speaks, and when she does, it's in a very repetitive, monotone voice. She has difficulty picking up or responding to social cues, and most importantly, has difficulty interpreting or expressing emotions. When it comes to representation in media, attempting to represent neurodiversity is an incredibly sharp double-edged sword. If done well, it can be a great way of being inclusive and normalizing people who are neurodivergent and think differently from normal people. But if done poorly, it can come off as forced, insincere, or offensive. It's incredibly rare for anime to attempt to be overly inclusive or go out of its way to represent minority groups, which can either be seen as a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. In the case of autism, Mashiro is the only character I've seen in anime who I think displays enough symptoms and traits to the point where I believe it to be intentional. As someone who is on the spectrum myself, I mean, why do you think I make Elder Scrolls memes? Mashiro is a character that I strongly relate to, and as such, her character is one of the reasons I love this anime so much. Despite being deliberately written to be hard to relate to, Mashiro is ironically one of the most human characters in the entire anime, and perhaps one of the most human characters in anime as a whole. And I think that's what makes this anime so incredible. It's how human the characters are. Not just Mashiro, but all the residents of Sakurasou. Sorata, Nanami, Jin, Misaki, Ryunosuke, each and every one of them has their own dreams, goals, hardships, flaws, and personal growth. The way the anime portrays each and every one of their struggles is just so incredibly real and compelling. And the color motif really brings it all together. While each character is strong on their own, when blended together like colors on a palette, they become much more. If a story is a canvas, then the characters are the colors making the painting. But of course, this anime doesn't just excel with its characters. Let's talk about the more light-hearted aspects of this anime, like the humor. You know, a common criticism for this anime that I tend to see is that a lot of people seem to think that it's not funny. And I'm here scratching my head wondering if they're watching the same damn show. For the most part, I don't really tend to find most anime to be very funny a lot of the time. In general, it's pretty hard to make me laugh, and unless it's a Breaking Bad meme or a One Piece edit, you're likely not going to get much more than a light exhale from me. Yeah, there are points when I'm watching an anime where I think, that's kinda funny. But rarely do you ever actually see me burst into laughter. However, there are a select few anime that are not only able to make me laugh out loud, but do it consistently. These anime are Konosuba, Nichijo, Danshi Kokosei no Nichijo, Kaguya-sama, Steins Gate, the dub specifically,
Balls or not, man, I would so hit that.
the Monogatari series, and of course Sakurasou no Pet Kanojo. I can't really describe it, but this anime has a certain energy and comedic style that blends just the right amount of visual, character, and dialogue related humor. I think what really brings the humor together is the characters and just how well they play off of each other. And that's not only due to the brilliant characterization, but also the timing and execution of the jokes, especially the delivery, which is absolutely just top notch. The voice acting in this anime is simply amazing, and the voice actors all have a ton of chemistry. Yoshitsugu Matsuoka, I'll just call him Yoshimatsu. Yoshimatsu absolutely killed it when voicing Sorata. When you remove the voice acting part, Sorata is an alright straight man. But when you put in Yoshimatsu's incredible delivery, then he suddenly graduates from being an alright straight man to one of the best of all time. Add that with Ai Kayono's amazing deadpan delivery as Mashiro, and you get one of the funniest duels in anime. These two voice actors have incredible chemistry and play off of each other so incredibly well, not just comedically, but emotionally and narratively. In fact, wait, something's off.
お弁当を作りたい。弁当を作りたい。
いいかシーナ。人類には素晴らしい可能性が秘められている。だからといってできないこともあるんだ。人に翼は生えない。
No, it can't be.
チェスは2人0は有限確定完全情報ゲーム。運が介在する余地がないこのゲームは原理上明確な必勝法がある。
チェスなんてただの丸抜ゲーム。
You son of a bitch! I fucking knew these two sounded familiar. Not only did they use the same voice actors as Sorata and Mashiro for Sora and Shiro, but they even have similar names as well. Do you have no shame? Well, it's not really a big deal since I love them in No Game No Life too, so yeah. And it's not just Sorata and Mashiro that are funny. Nearly every single character elevates this show's funniness factor. Misaki is incredibly entertaining to watch. You never know what she's gonna say or do, so she always ends up enhancing the scene that she's in. Natsumi Takamori also brings so much energy to the role. Jin's sarcastic comments always make me crack up as well, and Takahiro Sakurai absolutely killed it in the voice acting department. Honestly, this is one of my favorite roles of his. His voice is so cool and distinct, and he makes Jin sound like some sort of reliable mentor, which is very much a type of role that he's very good at. Basically, every single one of his characters is a massive Giga Chad. Except Suzaku, he's an idiot.
Bullying, knock it off. Racism, knock it off. Bigotry, knock it off. Crime, knock it off. Robbing banks, knock it off. Not saying thanks, knock it off. Driving tanks, don't do that. War is bad, leave it in the past.
There's also just a bunch of other hilarious scenes and running gags that never fail to make me laugh. I love Mashiro's Plan C, or the scene where Sorata tries to punch Jin but he gets knocked out, or also the scene where Sorata teaches Mashiro to cook. That was very funny. Or how about literally every single word that comes out of Sorata's dad's mouth? I swear to God, this guy only appears in one episode, and he still manages to be one of the funniest characters in the entire series. He's honestly tied with Papa Shirogane for funniest dad in anime, though Papa Shirogane does have a bit of an edge since he's voiced by Dio. Let's talk about the show's art style. Am I the only one who thinks this anime's art style looks gorgeous? This anime has such a colorful, cel-shaded art style with high contrast and pastel-like backgrounds. Isn't that basically every anime? No! It's different, I think. While yes, the animation and character designs aren't anything special, I think the way the show utilizes its bright and colorful art style complements its literal artistic themes so incredibly well. If I were to describe the art style, I'd say it's a more toned down version of No Game No Life's art style. While No Game No Life takes place in a more fantastical world and setting, Sakurasou has a more grounded setting, which makes sense as to why the latter isn't as colorful and saturated as the former. Wait, that's the second time I mentioned No Game No Life. And wait just a second! The openings are written by the same person as well! Coincidence? Oh, actually, no, it's not a coincidence. These anime have the same director. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Huh. Yeah, and speaking of the openings, they're pretty good. For the most part, JC staff tends to make decent openings. In the case of Sakurasou, both the openings and endings are great for what they are, though the first ending is easily the best out of all of them. It's a great song, and the way it fades in at the end of each episode really adds a lot tonally. The best example being the fireworks scene in episode 8, though in that case they literally just skip out on the ending entirely and just play the entire song, and it works beautifully. And yeah, this anime does the whole playing the first opening in the final episode trope, and I love it just as much here as in any other anime. Its implementation is just so corny. In fact, the entire finale in general is corny as hell, but I absolutely love it because of that. I thrive off of this shit. There's much more I could talk about, like the voice acting in general being amazing, or the score being pretty good and thematically appropriate, or maybe I could just talk about how amazing Sorata's that is for 9 hours straight, but we don't have enough time for that for now. Maybe in a follow-up video. But that's enough about all the little stuff I don't have enough to say about to put in their own individual categories. Let's get into the real meat of the video. It's time to talk about themes. Sakurasou is an anime where nearly every aspect of it is created in service to its themes. The debate of whether talent or hard work is more important to success is a complex one, and the anime has a fairly nuanced take on the matter, and the conclusion that it eventually comes to isn't black or white either. The anime starts developing these themes incredibly early on, as early as episode 2, and it's given quite a bit of a deeper exploration from episode 4 onwards. The moment where it's first foreshadowed is, as I said, in episode 2, when Mashiro examines Sorata in his underwear and comments on his toned physique, which sounds incredibly weird out of context. Wait, no, actually, this entire scene is weird and uncomfortable, even in context.
空と
今度はなんだよ。
セックスしたことある？
Anyway, as I was saying, Sorata responds by saying that he used to play soccer, but eventually quit. Mashiro asks him why, to which he initially hesitates to answer, but eventually he says it wasn't worth the effort. After playing for 9 years, he eventually got to a point where he stopped improving despite his best efforts, and so he eventually stopped caring and ended up quitting by the time he was in high school. But of course, Mashiro initially doesn't understand Sorata's story, nor the point he was trying to make, since she's gone her entire life without knowing what it's like to fail. That is, of course, until episode 4, when she gets a call telling her that her entry for the manga competition was rejected. This scene and the scene that follows it stand out as they function as important character building moments. When Mashiro is given the news, Sorata's first instinct was to try to console her despite being completely aware that it wouldn't do anything. At this point, it becomes incredibly obvious what Sorata's doing here and what he's actually thinking, and so he stops and runs away in shame. The scene then cuts to him sitting out in the rain brooding, and then he says this.
最低だ。何が最低だって？
The conversation that follows is a poignant one, as it reveals a lot about both Sorata and Jin and their mutual struggle of being close to people of great talent. Sorata reveals to Jin that deep down, he was relieved that Mashiro's manga was rejected, despite knowing how hard she worked on it. Jin in turn admits that he hoped for Misaki's new anime to fail. This exchange for the first time highlights both Sorata's self-loathing and his inferiority complex. In this scene, Jin attempts to give Sorata solidarity, and acknowledges his struggle of being a normal person in close proximity to genius. People like Mashiro and Misaki are so extraordinarily talented that it's impossible not to feel inferior, or perhaps even resentful. In the end, when you're confronted with talented individuals, it's hard not to compare yourself to them and feel hopeless. I think Jin puts it best here.
才能ってやつはさ、無自覚に周囲にいる人間を巻き込んでボロボロにしていくんだよ。近くにいればいるほどズタズタに引き裂かれちまうんだ。凡人には到底たどり着けない高みに生きる連中ってのがいる。俺たちには見えもしない雲の上の世界。そういう世界にあいつらはいる。
This point specifically definitely gets its footing in this scene, and is greatly expanded upon as the show progresses. The feeling of being overshadowed by someone better than you really hurts. Not only does it hurt emotionally, but it also potentially hurts your own growth as well. In the meantime, in episode 5, Nanami moves into Sakurasou. I'm sorry I haven't talked about her much until now, but I figured this segment is probably the best place to talk about her role in the story, since as I said before, she's by far the best representation of this theme out of any character. At this point, Nanami has been established as an incredibly hard worker. She works several jobs just to pay her voice acting school, which she is paying for with her own money, refusing financial aid from her parents. The reason she joined Sakurasou in the first place was because the rent was cheaper than normal dorms. This makes her the only resident of Sakurasou who is there by choice, rather than being sent there due to breaking the school rules. And afterwards, it becomes incredibly apparent in episode 5 and 6 that she's very opposed to receiving help from anyone. On top of her temporarily taking over Mashiro duty for Sorata, this eventually leads to her burning the candle at both ends, as she ends up becoming sick on the day of her audition, leading her to fail despite the amount of effort she put in beforehand. After episode 6, Nanami becomes much more receptive to receiving help, but her inherent stubbornness still remains a significant character trait. It's revealed that the reason for her stubbornness is that her father disapproves of her becoming a voice actress. She moved all the way from Osaka to attend Suimei to pursue her dream of voice acting, which is why she sometimes speaks in Kansai dialect. Due to her pursuing her dream against her family's wishes, she feels a need to prove herself capable of doing it alone without anyone's support. This facade very quickly shatters, however, as she just ends up harming herself and works without considering the limits of her own abilities. In the grand scheme of things, Nanami is in a much more difficult position than the other characters, as while Mashiro, Misaki, and Ryunosuke are naturally talented in their respective fields, and Jin and Sorata have essentially infinite time to pursue their own goals, Nanami is forced to qualify for voice acting school before reaching her 3rd year. Otherwise, if she fails, she'll be forced to come back to Osaka and give up on her dream. This puts a lot of pressure on her, as she has a hard time limit for herself to achieve her goals. This results in her spending a lot of time practicing and working towards becoming a voice actress. So due to all of this pressure, and her intense dedication, she must eventually succeed in the end, right? Well, We'll talk about that later. For now, let's talk about Sorata's goals. At the end of episode 4, Sorata makes the decision to stay at Sakurasou and work to become a professional game designer. This becomes his goal for the remainder of the series, and plays a huge role in his development as a character. Skip to episode 8, and Sorata has submitted a pitch to a major game development company, and has to present it to a board of directors. He fucks it up, so he goes back home and broods like he always does, and of course, Mashiro tells him that her manga has officially been serialized. Oops! You could probably tell how he feels here. Now, there's not really much to dissect from this episode. Sorata does a presentation, he fails, and now he's sad about it while Mashiro continues succeeding at everything she does, just to rub salt in the wound. However, I think the most important part of this episode is definitely the ending. Jin suddenly decides to throw Nanami a welcome party, even though it's obvious that he's just trying to cheer up Sorata, and the gang sneaks off to the pool at night because this is an anime and we need a pool episode. However, they get caught and they run off. As they start to run away, this happens. Anyway, although the point the episode was trying to make is about as subtle as a sledgehammer to their nuts, I think it's still incredibly significant. What Mashiro tells Sorata here is important, as it's what gives him the motivation to continue to move on, even if she meant it very literally here. It's true. Moving forward is his best and only course of action. There's no point in moping around or giving up when he only just started, and that's all that matters. However, now we get to episode 9 and 10 where things ramp up, as we're now introduced to two very important characters, Rita and Ryunosuke. Yeah, Ryunosuke has already been introduced from episode 1, but so far he's really only been a side character. Not only is this the first time we actually see him in person, as he's in his room all day and only communicates through text, but from here on out he becomes a true member of the main cast and an important part of the story. Also, I just love the classroom scene because it just hits so close to home. I was exactly like this in high school, and I'm only a little ashamed to admit that.
Unfortunately, I hate women. That sounds like a you problem, Chief. I am also homophobic.
On the other hand, this is truly the first time we're introduced to Rita. She was briefly mentioned by Mashiro's editor in a previous episode, but here she's given a full introduction, and not a very flattering one at that. Yeah, Rita's a real piece of work in these 2 episodes. She gets way better as the series goes on, but this is honestly the most I've ever wanted to bitch slap an anime character before. Second most. So essentially, Rita is Mashiro's childhood friend from England. She's come over to Japan with the intention of taking her back. But of course, Mashiro wants none of that, as she is dead set on making manga. Rita attempts to justify this by saying that Mashiro is squandering her talent by focusing on manga instead of painting, which is very obviously a load of shit. Sorata partially buys into Rita's excuse, as he remains on the fence about the issue. Ryunosuke, however, sees clean through her. There's a scene where Rita helps Sorata with a storyboard for Sakurasou's school festival project. She mentions to him that she quit painting and how hard it must be for him to work with talented people like Mashiro and Misaki. But Sorata's an idiot, so he doesn't know what she's talking about, because he doesn't understand subtext. But of course later, Ryunosuke confronts Rita about this and spells it out for her in plain text.
こんばんは。お前の思惑通りに行くと思うな、居候娘。
何がおっしゃりたいのでしょう。
神田はお前が忘れたものを持っているということだ。
私のことをずいぶんよくご存知なんですね。
絵はもうやめたそうだな。それだけ知っていれば察しはつく。
Then later, we get to the scene where everything comes out. To add context, Sakurasou is working on a large project for the school festival called Nyaporon. The deadline is coming soon, and the workload is too much for them to finish on time. The solution would be to have one extra helping hand to speed up the process, but there's nobody else at Sakurasou who could fill that role. That is until Mashiro suggests that Rita could help out. But well, you could probably tell how that's gonna go. But it's their only option anyway, and the scene that follows is one of the hardest for me to watch. It's ugly. Rita proceeds to berate Mashiro for wanting her help, throwing insults at her. She shifts all the blame of her own failure onto Mashiro, saying she's the reason why she quit painting. Years of work to become a professional painter, and she was never good as Mashiro. She could have never hoped to be as good as Mashiro, and so she grew to resent her, pretending to support her dream of making manga just to get rid of her, and of course openly insulting her dream right to her face. I'm going to be blunt. This is one of the most pathetic rants I've ever seen. This scene fills me with rage every time I watch it. It's abundantly clear that Rita has no control or agency over her own life. Her supposed passion for painting suddenly disappears when confronted with someone who is better than her. She can't take responsibility for her own failure, so she uses Mashiro as a scapegoat, a punching bag to try to heal her own bruised ego. I honestly would have stopped watching if Ryunosuke didn't immediately put the bitch in her place. This is one of the most incredible verbal smackdowns I have ever seen. This is very much a Hachiman and Oregairu Season 1 finale moment. The way he so directly and precisely calls her out on her bullshit is magnificent. He's unfazed by her insults, sees right past her dumb sob story, and immediately points out her hypocrisy, calling into question her passion for art in the first place. It's not Mashiro's fault that Rita quit art. It's her own fault. She's the one who made the choice to stop painting. It was her decision, not anyone else's. Her priority wasn't her own happiness. It was to please and impress others. When Ryunosuke asks Rita what it is that she truly wanted, she doesn't have an answer. She couldn't think of an insult or comeback, because she knew that he was right. Afterwards, Sorata confronts Rita and consoles her for some reason. Rita and Mashiro make up, they convince her to help with Nyaporon, and everything goes well. She even ends up apologizing to Ryunosuke. How nice. Yeah, okay, as much as I love this anime, I do have to criticize how quickly Rita's forgiven here. Her mindset is easily one of the most toxic and destructive mindsets an artist can have, and I think the anime doesn't really do a great job at condemning it. It's a shame, because Rita does actually end up redeeming herself later on. It's just that I think she got away with her toxic behavior without any repercussions. After this, Rita ironically becomes interested in Ryunosuke, and the relationship that develops is actually kinda wholesome, for the most part. Now I'm actually going to skip all the way to episode 16 here. Episodes 11 through 15 are definitely important, don't get me wrong, but I'll be talking about them in the next segment since here, they don't really contribute to the topic at hand. Don't worry, I'll get to them later, I promise. Now in episode 16, Sorata has another game pitch presentation, and this time it goes a lot smoother. Beforehand, Sorata asked Mashiro to make concept art for his pitch, and it ended up helping quite a lot. By the way, this fact will become incredibly important later. Though the presentation wasn't a complete success, the company gives Sorata the opportunity to work with one of their directors to refine and revise his pitch, who just so happens to be an alumnus from Suimei and someone Sorata looks up to. Next episode, Nanami finally has her final audition. If she passes, her career as a voice actress will finally begin. After a minor mishap with her train being delayed and probably one of the worst fake confessions I've ever seen, she ends up making it to the audition. It's not until a few episodes later that we finally get her results. And well, she failed. After 2 years of voice acting school, working, practicing, and trying her hardest to achieve her dream, she still came up short. All of that established hard work she put in, all of that dedication and determination, all of it for nothing. She initially takes the rejection quite well, saying that she's done all she could and that there are more pressing matters at hand. So despite her failure, Nanami ends up taking it pretty well, right? Well, the next episode paints a very different picture. It's a rainy day, everyone's in class, and a lot's going on in these characters' heads, and things don't look very bright. And then, all of a sudden, unable to keep it in, Nanami starts crying. Everyone looks at her worried. Then Sorata, out of concern, brings her to the nurse's office. She says that she's calmed down and she'll be fine by herself, so Sorata hesitantly walks back to class, only to get interrupted by a phone call. And not a very good one at that. Sorata receives news from Kazuki Fujisawa, the game developer that Sorata was working with to revise his game pitch. That said pitch had been rejected. And what's worse, it was rejected in favor of another person's pitch who just so happened to have a cheaper and lower risk idea than Sorata's, that also just so happens to be in the same genre. His idea was rejected due to factors outside of his control. Of course, Sorata takes this very hard, but after he gets a quick text from Ryunosuke, he quickly realizes that he's not the only one who's hurting. Sorata rushes to the nurse's office, only to see that Nanami is gone. He scrambles to find her, and then quickly spots her standing outside in the pouring rain, utterly defeated. This scene right here is one of the most heartbreaking and emotionally devastating scenes in the entire show. This is the moment where these characters are at their absolute lowest point. They've been knocked down, forced to fight a losing battle for their own livelihoods, and on top of all that, they have been told that all of the work that they've put in has been for nothing. Nanami vents to Sorata how her pursuit of voice acting has affected her high school life. She struggled to make money to afford classes, and was made to work several jobs and constantly practiced and auditioned, never having enough time to hang out with friends or enjoy herself, always being crushed under the weight of her pursuits. And after all of that, she still failed. She did everything she could. She worked harder than anyone else, and she still failed. No more opportunities. No more second chances. Her dream was crushed. While Sorata's position does not compare to Nanami's, his own failure still hurt. His pitch that he spent a great amount of time and effort and passion working on had been rejected due to no fault of his own. The world is cruel. It doesn't care about how much work and passion someone puts in, how much they had to sacrifice. Sometimes it's just not enough. After everyone's done crying, everyone all goes home after school, and then, as if the world itself was taunting him, Sorata receives a letter in the mail that ends up breaking him. I wish I had the will to get angry at Sorata here as I usually do. I wish I had the energy to go off on him about his frankly unwarranted outburst here, but I just don't. Watching this scene doesn't make me feel angry like other bad Sorata scenes do. It just makes me feel empty and sad, because even though his rant was poorly timed and in bad faith, even though his anger was directed at the wrong place and there was so many other ways he could have dealt with it, he still had every right to be mad. Not at Mashiro, but at the world. But what if I told you the world wasn't their biggest enemy? What if all this time, their biggest obstacle wasn't the external threat of rejection, but rather something that came from within? A thought, a feeling, something that we've all felt at some point. The words that we think to ourselves, I'm not good enough. While not every character in the show suffers from the exact same challenges, they do, however, all suffer from the same deep-seated insecurity. The idea that no matter how hard they try, they will never be good enough. This applies to absolutely everything. Working to succeed as an artist, as a voice actor, as a writer, as a game designer. The fear that you'll never be good enough to be with someone you like, or be a good enough person for them. Even the simple ability to reach out and form bonds with others, something that the average person takes completely for granted, is affected by this notion. Every single character in Sakurasou faces this fear, and it dictates so many of their actions and fuels nearly every conflict. Let's finally talk about Jin and Misaki. I've said before that romance isn't really the main focus of Sakurasou, and I stand by that. I'm not a huge fan of the love triangle between Sorata and Mashiro and Nanami. In fact, I kinda hate love triangles in general. However, I think the romance between Jin and Misaki, while bizarre, is incredibly well paced and satisfying, and in my opinion is one of the most underrated aspects of this anime. It's established incredibly early on that Jin and Misaki are childhood friends. They both grew up in the same hometown, and have always been by each other's side for as long as they can remember. However, it's also established that Misaki is in love with Jin, and constantly goes out of her way to try to win him over in the most over-the-top Misaki way possible, while at the same time being aware that Jin is a philandering playboy who enters sexual relationships with many women, some of which who are much older than him, and some who are already married. Yikes. Yeah, while I love Jin, this definitely isn't the reason why. His philandering is an odd character trait that, while not completely irrelevant, doesn't really come into effect a whole lot in the series, and isn't really justified early on. Other than, I guess, the fact that Jin just really loves the pussy, am I right, boys? Oh my god, that joke sucked. No, but in all seriousness, it's a really strange character quirk at first, but eventually as the story goes on, it's eventually revealed that his playboy attitude was just a facade, a front that he puts on as a sort of coping mechanism. For what exactly? Well, as you could probably guess, his own insecurities. While Misaki is obsessed with the idea of being in a relationship with Jin, from an outsider's perspective, it appears that Jin seems to want none of that. While he never rejects her outright, a lot of the time he simply ignores her or acts coldly towards her. But why? They get along incredibly well, they're very close, and it appears that he truly does care for her. So what's his reason for avoiding her? Well, we do eventually get the answer, and it's that he truly does love her and wants to be with her, but he views himself as unworthy. It's clear that behind the confident, I don't care what anybody thinks about me persona, he sees himself as a failure, someone who doesn't deserve to be with someone as great as Misaki. It's important to understand that Misaki has always been considered a prodigy. Ever since they were kids, Jin was always behind Misaki. Misaki was a genius, but even back then, she was called an alien, someone that the people around her refused to understand. But despite that, Jin treasured her dearly. He wanted to always be there for her, but in the end, he was afraid. He was afraid of hurting her. He was afraid that being with Misaki would make him lose focus and try not to become a better person. He felt that he wasn't good enough. In a flashback, we see that Jin used to actually be in a relationship with Misaki's older sister, Fuka. It appears that Fuka was serious about their relationship, but in the end, Jin wasn't. He wasn't dating her because he truly thought she was the one for him. He was dating her because she looks identical to Misaki, and in the end, she was only a substitute for Misaki in his mind. An excuse, a distraction to keep him away from confronting his own feelings for her. He never admitted it, but when Fuka confronts him about it in the flashback, he never denies it either. It was his fear that made him keep his feelings for her bottled up. It was his fear that drove him to mess around with other girls just to keep his feelings at bay. Misaki, however, doesn't bottle up her emotions. She makes it abundantly clear that she wants to be with Jin. Her fear was that Jin just wasn't interested in her. But the truth is, she was the only girl he truly had eyes for. He just didn't believe that he deserved it. I think that's what makes the early reveal that Jin was planning on going to university in Osaka away from Misaki so important. It was Jin finally taking the steps he believes he needed to become the man that she deserves. The other characters in the show didn't really understand this decision, and it's easy to see why. Since he doesn't really make his intentions obvious to others, Jin confesses his feelings for Misaki, and reveals to her why he made the decision to go to university in Osaka, but because Misaki is so single-minded in her affection towards Jin, she didn't take this particularly well. She wants to be with Jin here and now, and she doesn't care about the consequences. She even openly admits that she would do anything to be with him, even quit making anime. Eventually, however, she realizes that Jin loves her for who she is, and she shouldn't have to sacrifice anything to obtain his affection. In episode 18, Sorata attempts to bring Jin and Misaki together to finally talk things out, to finally come to an understanding, but they're hesitant. Jin is still acting cold, and Misaki has done a complete 180 and is entirely fixated on finishing her anime. She was so eager to try to get Jin to be with her before, so what's with the change? Well, she finally admits it. She's scared. In fact, they both do. Even when they're both given an opportunity to finally confront their feelings for each other, their insecurities take over. It's not until Sorata and Nanami physically force them that they finally talk to each other. Here, Jin finally admits that the reason he's attending college in Osaka is because it's better for his career as a scriptwriter. Despite being able to work with Misaki for years, he's been painfully aware that his work doesn't meet her high standards. Misaki is coy with his confession, but ultimately admits that he's right. His work isn't good enough. Jin wants to be with Misaki, but he cares about his future career too, and says that he wants to stand on equal footing with her, instead of being constantly behind her like he has been all these years. I honestly do love how heartfelt this scene is. After all this time of both of them being unable to properly communicate each other's feelings, we finally get to see them be honest for the first time, and it's a beautiful conclusion to two frankly underrated character arcs. Jin and Misaki are finally able to confront their insecurities and take full initiative, they no longer have to be afraid of not being good enough, because in the end, if their fear prevents them from acting, nothing will change, and true failure is guaranteed. And that last part is important, because I believe there's no other character that this applies to more than Sorata. It's abundantly clear that Sorata has a massive inferiority complex, sometimes to an incredibly annoying degree. From the very beginning, Sorata's indecisiveness and lack of control of his own life is due to his omnipresent fear of failure and rejection. I mean, the anime's first line accurately describes his mindset.
似たような毎日をどこか退屈だと思ってた。何も起こらないことを誰かのせいにしてた。
Whenever things don't go his way, he tries to find an excuse, a scapegoat. This refusal to take responsibility is one of the most important and often one of his most infuriating character traits. I've made it pretty apparent that I really don't like Sorata, but that's not because I think he's a bad or poorly written character. Far from it, actually. I think it stems from the fact that his deep-seated fear and insecurity tends to be the root cause of a lot of the conflicts in the anime. And a lot of the times, his method of dealing with it is to avoid dealing with it. He chooses to ignore his problems. Even though Sorata is denser than osmium, I don't think he fully lacks self-awareness. In fact, I think he's completely aware that he's a horse's ass. Painfully aware. I think at the start, he always wanted to pursue a career in game design, but was just afraid of failing. He didn't want to commit. Even when he had taken in the cats, and was forced to move to Sakurasou, he wasn't even fully committed to giving them homes either. It's not until he meets Mashiro and is confronted with her single-minded devotion and obsession with manga that he gains the motivation to finally pursue something that he truly wanted. Him claiming to want to leave Sakurasou at the beginning, yet doing nothing about it, was no different to how he approached everything else in his life. And while he goes through major character development throughout, the change is gradual, and at times you can really see him slip into old habits, or turn out to not be as committed or enlightened as he thought he was. Sorata is a deeply, deeply flawed character, but I have no doubt that this is intentional. It may seem counterintuitive to have a main character that the audience doesn't cheer for 100% of the time. Hell, sometimes the audience hates his guts, but it's the fact that he's so clearly flawed, which makes his role in the story as strong as it is. Sorata has some awful moments that I'm still not over to this day. In fact, episode 13 is definitely where he's at his worst. I was hesitant to talk about episode 13, as it is incredibly hard for me to sit through. By the end of it, I wanted to punch him so badly. In fact, I went on a very heated rant in my notes while rewatching it, but in hindsight, I did go a bit too far. I had a bit of a heated gamer moment, if you will. To add context, in episode 13, Sorata notices that Mashiro has started acting differently. Before, all she cared about was drawing manga, but now she's going out of her way to try to be closer to him and gain his approval. Any normal human being would notice this and immediately recognize that she has developed feelings for him. But because Sorata has smooth brain, he instead is more focused on the fact that she doesn't seem to care as much about her manga as she used to. He acts out because of this, and the absolute worst moment is when he gets a letter telling him that one of his game pitches was rejected, but instead of owning up to it, or dealing with the rejection in a healthy way, he instead yells at Mashiro and takes it out on her. This is when I had my heated gamer moment. Now, I've been spending the past few minutes talking shit about Sorata and making him look bad, when this video is supposed to be about me praising this anime. This seems counterintuitive, but the thing is, I can't in good faith call this bad writing. As much as I want to bash his skull in with a baseball bat, I completely understand why he acts this way. And like I said, he knows he's being a horse's ass. Jin specifically calls him out on this.
聞いてました。全部聞こえてた。俺、どう見えます？性格悪く見えるって言えば満足するのか？
Sorata's insecurity and self-loathing are his biggest obstacle, and essentially, this anime is about him getting over it. There are times where they end up winning and taking over him, and as unpleasant as those moments are, they're important. Most good character arcs aren't completely linear. Sometimes, characters will make great progress, and then at some point regress and temporarily go back to their old ways. While I wouldn't say this approach is objectively better, it is much more realistic, and in a way it makes the character much more believable. I think in this sense, Rita is actually meant to be a reflection of this part of Sorata. Rita back in episode 10 was just like Sorata, but her insecurities have taken over her completely. By the time she's introduced, she's already been completely broken down by her feelings of inferiority towards Mashiro, and it takes her getting a reality check from Ryunosuke for her to realize how much it's consumed her. I think if Sorata never had the support he did from the others from Sakurasou, he very well could have ended up the same way. In a way, he's incredibly lucky that he has that support, or else he would have given up early on, or never even attempted to chase his dreams in the first place. Speaking of Rita and Ryunosuke, let's briefly talk about them. Ryunosuke is very much a character that tries not to show vulnerability. He's stoic and practical-minded to a fault, and as such, we don't really know what's going on inside his head most of the time. He spends a lot of time calling people out on their hypocrisy and biases, but he never sits down to evaluate his own biases. And I think that's where Rita comes in. Despite receiving such an intense verbal smackdown from him, she's actually grateful towards him and becomes romantically interested in him. While this is mostly played for laughs, later on in the show she gives him support and shows genuine concern for his reclusive tendencies. Ryunosuke is a hardcore hikikomori, especially early on when we don't even know what he looks like until episode 9. As revealed later on, his reclusiveness is due to his distrust of others, resulting from his old friends abandoning him years ago. In this case, while he never shows or admits it, this is a clear case of his distrust and dislike of people being a result of yet another fear of rejection. And it's because of the support from Rita and the others living at Sakurasou that he eventually gets over this too, and finally comes out and feels comfortable interacting with others. He's finally able to trust people again, without the fear of them leaving him like his old friends did. And I think this is a good place for me to segue into the next part I want to talk about. The importance behind Sakurasou itself and what it represents. One omnipresent aspect of Sakurasou, the anime, that is often overlooked is Sakurasou, the building. It's the anime's main setting, and is often ignored for most of its runtime. It's an old decrepit building meant to shelter the students that break the rules. And while from that description you'd expect it to be filled with delinquents and such, in reality it's just home to a bunch of eccentric people. It's established that the other students view it as a den of weirdos, a place you never want to end up in. And in the first few episodes, Sorata's main goal was to leave Sakurasou and return to the normal dorms. But of course, despite the sour reputation, you realize that the residents of Sakurasou aren't really hurting anyone. Yeah, they do things differently and don't follow the school rules, but it's also home to some of the most talented and accomplished students within the school. Misaki is the creator of a highly acclaimed anime that is actually broadcasted on TV, and has the highest grades of any student in the entire school. Ryunosuke is a professional programmer who works in the industry and is incredibly skilled at what he does. Mashiro is a published mangaka who was also previously a world-famous master painter. These are people who have accomplished more as students than most adults working full-time in their respective industries. Yet despite all that, Sakurasou was looked down upon. Both it and its inhabitants are shunned by the rest of the school. Why? Well, probably the most obvious answer is refusal to conform. The societal pressure to conform is intrinsic to us humans, and even more so in Japanese culture. A collectivist society like Japan prioritizes conformity, as people are valued as mere cogs in the machine rather than as individuals. People who stand out are shunned and looked down upon. Those who don't fit in are seen as not contributing to society. And here we have the residents of Sakurasou, who are of course looked down upon because they don't fit in. Sakurasou is for those who break the school rules and are deemed unfit to live in regular dorms, and by extension, those who refuse to conform to society's expectations of them. The problem with this is that these people are artists, and conformity largely does not apply to art. Art is meant to be personal expression. It is meant to be a showcase of human creativity, and creativity is by definition the creation and usage of original ideas. Originality is heavily valued in artistic expression, and lack of originality is often chastised in the art world. So the very students who are looked down upon by being eccentric and nonconformist end up being great artists due to these very qualities. Their unique outlook on life allows them to be as successful as they are. So now, after taking all this time for us to get attached to these characters and to appreciate them for who they are as individuals, despite their quirks, we see them be confronted with one final hurdle. At the end of episode 18, they're told that at the end of the year, Sakurasou will be torn down and they will be forced to move into the regular dorms. These last 5 episodes detailing the residents of Sakurasou's fight to preserve it is this anime at its absolute peak. It is every theme and personal arc from each of our main characters culminated into what is perhaps one of my favorite arcs of all time. At first, the response to this information is that of confusion. Sakurasou wasn't simply being fixed or rebuilt, it's being torn down for good. It's a decision that came out of absolute nowhere without the students' input, and it also came about from an inspection that they were not warned about beforehand. It seems like a completely arbitrary decision, one that seems almost deliberately made to go against the students' wishes. It just didn't add up. Meanwhile, some have conflicted feelings towards this news. Sorata is outraged, fundamentally opposed to a decision that was made with no regard for the opinions of the inhabitants, a decision that would uproot their very way of life. Jin tries to be a bit more level-headed, understanding Sorata's position while admitting that this decision wouldn't affect him or Misaki much, due to the fact that they'll be graduating soon. And Ryunosuke tries to be as objective as possible, refusing to give his opinion on the matter, saying that doing so would be pointless, while also pointing out how much more convenient the regular doors are to live in comparison. I'll talk about Ryunosuke a little more in a bit, but suffice to say, the initial response isn't completely unanimous. In the end, however, they all agree to do something about it, as Jin believes he at least owes his underclassmen that much, and Ryunosuke is still skeptical about the rationale behind the decision in the first place. So they end up deciding to petition the student body to reverse the decision to demolish Sakurasou, but in order for it to pass, they need a 2/3 majority of the school to sign the petition, which is an absolutely absurd amount. Considering most of the seniors aren't even present due to them not needing to attend class, they'd need nearly all the first and second years to sign. Soon after, we find out the real reason behind Sakurasou being torn down. And it's not pretty. After hacking into the school's database, Ryunosuke finds a transcription of a board meeting from the school's board of directors and shows it to Sorata. As it turns out, destroying Sakurasou is merely a ploy to get Mashiro under the direct control of the school, as they believe that Sakurasou had been encouraging her to waste her talent on manga. Sorata is angered by this information, and nearly goes off to confront the principal himself, before being stopped by Ryunosuke because obviously admitting to the principal that they hacked into the school would only worsen their position. Now here I'm going to admit that Ryunosuke actually kinda loses me a bit, as he decides to put on his utilitarian hat and goes all in on his facts and logic mindset where it doesn't really apply. Ryunosuke tries to imply that the easiest way to prevent Sakurasou from being torn down is to let Mashiro leave. Which, man, Ryunosuke, that's cold, even for you. There are so many holes in his logic here that I can just sit here and poke, but what's more important is the argument that follows. Right here, I'll say that Ryunosuke is mostly right, but the core of his arguments come from a very disingenuous place. He's technically correct that the event of Sakurasou being torn down shouldn't adversely affect the relationships of those who live there, and that half of Sakurasou is going to be gone by the end of the year anyway. The problem is that he's clearly missing the point. Just because he's correct doesn't mean he's right. It's the principle of it all. Sakurasou isn't just going away temporarily, but permanently. While you could argue that Sakurasou being destroyed shouldn't affect any non-superficial friendships, it's because of Sakurasou that these people were brought together in the first place. Sakurasou is a place that brings like-minded individuals together. It's a shelter for those who are shunned by society, those who were cast out from the regular dorms due to not being compatible with the standards of the society they live in. And the fact that the board of directors wants to destroy it simply so that they can more easily control the future of a single student so that they can maintain a more clean outside image is absolutely abhorrent. The whole point of an art school is to encourage its students, to help guide them and nurture them so that they can pursue their own passions. This is an underhanded attempt to sterilize their students' creativity, to remove their individuality in order to vainly improve their own image to a world that does not care about artistic integrity. They don't care about their students. They care about themselves and how they look to the world. And I think Ryunosuke understands this, but he's so caught up in his devotion to impartiality that he ends up denying not only the feelings of others, but his own feelings as well. Later on in the episode, Rita actually calls him and confronts him on this. He's convinced himself that it's pointless because the odds are stacked against them. He gives up and tries to rationalize it by saying how he feels about it doesn't matter, since he figures it won't change anything. but without realizing it, he is doing the very thing that he called out Rita for back in episode 10. By denying his own feelings and giving up, he guarantees the loss of that which he cares about. And he truly does care about Sakurasou. He just doesn't want to admit it. And it's because of Rita's encouragement and support that he finally decides to help Sakurasou. One thing I want to call attention to is just how much Rita has changed up to this point. When she was first introduced, I hated her so much. She was the embodiment of a toxic mindset that I hated more than any other. She put up fake smiles to try to hide how far she had fallen to self-pity. She failed to live up to others' expectations of her, and blamed someone else for her failure. She couldn't take responsibility. She gave up and pretended it was someone else's fault. After being called out for her shitty behavior, she realized the way she acted was wrong, and she actually changed for the better. She went back to painting and creating art, not to gain anyone's approval, but because she simply loved doing it. Ryunosuke, though unintentionally, encouraged her to stand up for herself and understand the importance of human connection. And now, 10 episodes later, she does the same for him. It's incredibly rare to see a character truly make a 180 and redeem themselves fully. With characters that go through redemption arcs, either I like the character from the start all the way to the end despite their flaws, or I hate them from start to finish despite their supposed redemption. But here's a genuine case of a character that I hated at the beginning and ended up liking at the end. Sorry, I went on a tangent there. But one thing that Ryunosuke was right about was that trying to preserve Sakurasou was a losing battle, because throughout these past few episodes, despite how much our characters tried, despite how much they sacrificed, in the end, they couldn't get enough signatures. How could they? They needed basically all of the students to be on their side, and in the end, they just don't care. To them, Sakurasou was just a den of weirdos, a place you never wanted to end up. Who cares what happens to them? It's sad. It's unfair. It's straight up bullshit, I say. But that's the world for you. The world is sad. The world is unfair. The world is bullshit. The world just doesn't care. They failed, and there's nothing else they could have done about it. And now we come to the final 2 episodes, the graduation ceremony. After all that had happened, it was finally time to say goodbye. Misaki and Jin were graduating, and after the ceremony was over, everyone will have to move out of Sakurasou, and it will be gone forever. But then, everyone is caught off guard when the representative of the graduating class stands up to make a speech. Who is this representative, you may ask? None other than the school's most academically accomplished student, Misaki Kamigusa. This speech goes on for several more minutes, and I wish I could show all of it, but I can't because Jesus Christ, that would stall the video a ton and I'd basically be playing half the episode at that point. And despite all that, I can't bring myself to describe it. No words from me could truly describe the emotional weight this scene brings. It's a scene that really just speaks for itself. I've been sitting here for literal hours trying to give my thoughts here, but nothing I say could possibly give it justice. Despite attempts at direct intervention from the school staff, Misaki's speech ends up moving the students, and we get potentially one of the corniest scenes I have ever seen in an anime. Misaki begs everyone in the audience to support them, and overturn the school's decision to destroy Sakurasou, and then Sorata melodramatically comes up and yells out his appreciation towards Misaki and his friends at Sakurasou. The first opening starts playing in the background, and everyone else yells out their love and appreciation for each other in Sakurasou, while all the other students cheer in the background. This scene is so fucking corny, and I love it so much. This scene is cornier than the goddamn fucking Midwest, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. Even though they couldn't get enough signatures, Misaki's speech was enough to convince everyone to support Sakurasou and reverse the decision to tear it down. And it's here that a certain character says something that still sticks in my mind to this day. The school's former student council president comes out in support of Sakurasou and says this.
先生方もお認めになってはいかがですか。
立林。
もともと桜荘は社会の枠組みにこだわらず芸術家コースの生徒の才能を伸ばすために用意された寮だと聞いています。ルールを守らない問題児の彼らを正しいというつもりはありません。けれど自分の心に忠実に生き可能性にきちんと目を向け、そして
強い絆で結ばれた桜荘の連中を羨ましいと思っていたのも事実です。そう思っていたのはおそらく私だけではなかったということでしょ
う。Alright, I may be projecting here. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it. But if I'm right, holy motherfucking almighty Hatsukuri Mayoi, Sakurasou was originally built for special ed students! I know the wording here is vague, and as a former special ed student myself, I very may well be projecting hard. I mean, is it really that hard to believe that in this instance, at least half of Sakurasou's population is neurodivergent? I already mentioned Mashiro potentially being autistic, and I don't think this just applies to her either. To me, Ryunosuke seems like he could be on the spectrum as well, and Misaki... Honestly, I have no idea what Misaki is, but I will bet money that she ain't neurotypical. It's incredibly well established that these characters have had extreme difficulty adjusting to the norms of society. Mashiro had been alone for most of her life and never learned basic life skills. Ryunosuke has difficulty empathizing with others and expressing his own emotions. Misaki grew up with few friends and was called an alien. She always did her own thing. Though indirectly, Sakurasou helped them. It's clear that the original purpose of Sakurasou had been lost, and went from a place that was meant to help those who were struggling, to a place that was considered punishment for those who broke the rules. It had been neglected over time, and the school wanted to take it down because it soured their image. The mindset of the school had regressed, but Sakurasou still remained. Sakurasou wasn't the problem, they were just being who they were. The problem was society! Afterwards, we finally make it to the final episode. Not much happens. Jin leaves to go to Osaka for college. Nanami goes to convince her parents to give her a second chance to go back to voice acting school. Sodata continues on his journey to become a game developer. And some new characters we don't care about move into Sakurasou. How cool. All in all, I think this anime's ending is perfect the way it is, and we absolutely do not need a season 2. Okay, thank you. But hold on, we're not done. Even though I've talked about all the show's themes, its characters, and its arcs, there's one thing I've been waiting to talk about that I saved for the very end. Perhaps the most important thing. Even after all that, there is one thing about this anime that I love and remember more than anything else. The reason I wanted to make this video in the first place, and the reason it took 2 whole years for this video to come out. I want to finally talk about Mashiro. This is perhaps going to be the most personal part of the entire video, since I really can't talk about why Mashiro is such an important character to me without also talking about myself. Mashiro isn't just my favorite character from the show, nor is she simply my favorite character in anime. She's my favorite character in all of fiction. I love Mashiro. No, not like that! Seriously, why can't I have an attachment to an anime character without getting these kinds of reactions? I love Mashiro as a character, not as a waifu. Fucking degenerates. But that's beside the point. Mashiro means a lot to me, because when I see her, I see myself. That's right, I look at Mashiro and unironically think she just like me for real. Because there hasn't been any other character who I can personally relate to more than Mashiro. For some reason, at every moment I feel I can understand what she's thinking, how she feels, and what she's going through. If I'm starting to lose some of you, then I honestly wouldn't blame you. I probably sound absolutely insane right now. But think of a time when you felt this way with a fictional character. You see their struggles, and you think to yourself, I relate. I understand. That's how I feel with Mashiro. But how exactly? Well, as I said earlier in the video, I am autistic. It's something I've had for my entire life, and something that I've struggled with ever since I was a kid. Because autism is a spectrum, everyone experiences it differently, so I can only speak on behalf of my own experiences. There are some people who say autism is a superpower, but honestly, I find that to be a load of shit. Sure, I can recite nearly every single facet and detail of the lore of the Elder Scrolls universe, but is that really worth struggling to do basic shit such as doing the dishes, or fucking talking and making connections with other people? No, I don't think so. My whole life, I've struggled to make friends, and even when I did, I struggled to hold on to them. It wasn't until I was in middle school when I realized just how alone I was, and in high school, I nearly gave up entirely. When I said that I was like Ryunosuke when I was in high school, I wasn't kidding. It was the fucking worst. It took a ton of work for me to get to where I am now, where I'm at least somewhat okay with who I am. So when I found Sakurasou, and found myself relating so heavily to Mashiro, it felt like the first time in my entire life where I felt understood. I know it's not officially canon as to whether Mashiro is autistic or not, and I also know that she also unfortunately falls into the autistic savant trope that's cool to hate nowadays, and I completely understand how that could turn people off due to how horribly botched other pieces of media handle it. But what makes her so compelling to me is that the show humanizes her by highlighting what it's like to not be able to easily understand others, or be understood, and the potential guilt and self-loathing that comes with being a burden on them. And I honestly think it's a godsend that the show never outright says that she's autistic, because it means they avoided making her a label. It allows her to be her own person, instead of being perpetually linked to some condition. From a young age, Mashiro was considered a genius. She had been blessed with extraordinarily talent, and a deep intrinsic understanding of it that was completely unparalleled. But it was because of this talent, this gift, that she lived the life she did. As for most of her life, she wasn't treated as human. As far as others were concerned, she wasn't human. She was a tool to be used for making art that others used to gain money and fame. She was never a person, and it's because of this that she had been alone her entire life. She never had any real friends, other than Rita, who eventually grew to resent her due to her talent. She was never given a real education, she was never taught how to take care of herself. All she did was paint pictures. But most importantly, she never learned how to understand others, because other people never bothered to understand her. But everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. But everything changed when she decided to move to Japan, when she decided to make manga instead. Everything changed when she moved to Sakurasou, because for the first time in her entire life, she was treated like a human being. The residents of Sakurasou were the first people in her life who saw her for who she truly was, because the truth is, she is human. She had passions, goals, aspirations, and hardships. It wasn't until she moved into Sakurasou that she finally began to open up and understand the importance of friendship. For her entire life, art was everything to her. It was all she did, all she cared about. But now there are people who cared about her rather than just her art. She realized that drawing pictures wasn't everything, and the person she grew attached to most was Sorata, because he was the first person who admired her dedication to her craft rather than someone who used or resented her for it. But unfortunately, it's never that easy. She didn't understand how different she was, and how could she? It wasn't until recently that she finally understood that there was more to life than drawing and painting. She didn't choose to be different. She didn't choose to be this way. She didn't know how to reach out, how to talk to people. She didn't understand the feelings of others, nor could she understand her own. Part of why I was so enraged by Sorata's behavior in episode 13 and 14 was because it reminded me of the times when I was on the receiving end of people like him. He was the person Mashiro looked up to the most. All she wanted was his approval, some form of acknowledgement, but he denied it from her. I can't imagine how frustrating that is for her. No, that's a lie. I can't imagine it, because I've been in that position so many times. One of the things that makes Mashiro so compelling is the absolutely amazing performance from Ai Kayano. Her performance as Mashiro is easily my favorite voice acting performance of all time. Though I'm not an expert on Japanese voice acting, the way she approaches the role feels restrained. What I mean is, she's able to be incredibly expressive without actually expressing, if that makes any sense. It's incredibly subtle, and I can absolutely tell how incredibly difficult it is to pull that off. Ai Kayano was able to portray a character that has difficulty expressing emotions without making it feel forced. Just listen to the scene where she tries to reconcile with Sorata.
美味しいからソラタに食べてほしくて。
それで出てきたのか。お前何考えてんだよ。
だってソラタ最近ずっと怒ってるから、私 たくさん話したいことあるのに嫌な顔ばかりで、そんなの嫌だからどうすればいいか考えて、どうすれば空田が喜んでくれるのか、どうすれば楽しくなるのか、でもわからなくて、私これしかできない。
You can just hear the sad frustration and subtle desperation in her voice. Kanojo was able to make her sound this way while still having it sound like Mashiro. That is some incredible voice acting skill. And it's with cases like this that we see that Mashiro isn't a two-dimensional character. Well, I mean, she literally is 2D since she is an anime character, but you know what I mean. She isn't always serious or monotone. She's capable of being happy or sad, angry or frustrated. She's even capable of joking around. I mean, do you really think she's being serious whenever she brings up Plan C? No, because she isn't just one thing all the time. One thing that is often overlooked is how the anime portrays her struggles with connecting with others as equatable to the other character struggles with succeeding as artists. Mashiro finds art incredibly easy and effortless, but also finds normal things that others take for granted extremely difficult. Her struggles and desires were just as real as anybody else's, and that is exactly what makes her so human. As each of our main characters try their hardest to succeed in their own fields, but end up failing over and over again, so does Mashiro struggle with the simple act of human connection, something most normal people understand and find incredibly easy. Because of how much help she needs, it's clear that she ends up seeing herself as a burden on others. She's not stupid. She understands how much other people sacrifice for her. One of the best early examples of this is in episode 6. Nanami stubbornly takes over Mashiro duty from Sorata despite already spreading herself thin. Of course, it doesn't go easy, and we see Mashiro visibly express guilt for Nanami overexerting herself. When Nanami gets sick on the day of her audition, Mashiro feels responsible, despite Nanami already overworking herself prior. Because of this, Mashiro is adamant about having Nanami attend her auditions anyway, despite understanding that she was already screwed at that point. It's clear that she cares a lot for the others at Sakurasou. It's the closest thing she's ever had to a family before, and it's obvious that she deeply treasures the friendship that she shares with them. And there's no other point in the show that better showcases how much Sakurasou means to her, and the guilt that she carries that comes from feeling like a burden on others, than episode 22. At this point, we're at the height of the show's final arc, and I've already talked at length about how much the decision of Sakurasou being torn down has affected everybody, but there's absolutely no one who this has affected more than Mashiro. Over the past few episodes, Mashiro has been more desperate than ever, as Sakurasou means everything to her. She was originally just as clueless as everyone else about it, but after she eavesdropped on the argument between Sorata and Ryunosuke, and saw just how much everybody had been fighting to keep Sakurasou standing, she understood, or at least she thought she did. She barely says anything, but just by looking at her, I knew that she was overburdened with guilt, and couldn't bring herself to express it. Due to how much everyone else had suffered, things reach a breaking point at the end of episode 21, when Sorata fully gives into despair. I've already shown you this scene earlier, but I want to reiterate just how much this hurts to watch. For the past 2 episodes, Mashiro had been mostly quiet, while occasionally feigning ignorance about the rationale behind Sakurasou being destroyed. But here, she let Sorata know that she understood everything he just said, and why he said it. And it breaks my heart so much. Things go from bad to worse, as the next morning, Sorata discovers that Mashiro has gone missing. Sorata immediately understands why, and gets everyone to scramble to find her. Everyone then quickly runs off to the school to look for her, and that's when they find this.
この絵、真っ白ちゃんが？
間違いないよ。
これ、俺か。
そうだよ。他にも。真っ白すごい。
本当にな。きっとこの絵は歴史に名を刻んだ有名な画家にだって描けない。この絵は桜荘を大切に思う真っ白の心そのものだから。
This image broke me. Never in my life have I been so completely floored by a painting before. This painting, This painting says everything. It contains all of the pent-up emotions that Mashiro couldn't express herself. It's all of her love, all of her gratitude, all of her guilt, and all of her pain, all into one beautiful image. She had spent the last 2 episodes painting this masterpiece. But there's one thing to point out. The one aspect of this painting that most accurately portrays the pain she felt while making it. She's not in it. This hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't think I can even begin to explain why this hurts. It just speaks for itself. It's clear that Mashiro knows she's the reason why Sakurasou is being torn down. She believes that her leaving will make everything go back to normal, and that everyone will be fine without her. And it's in the scene that's to come, where we understand why she feels this way. Afterwards, as Sorata rushes to find her, he repeats to himself the anime's opening line.
似たような毎日をどこか退屈だと思っていた。何も起こらないことを誰かのせいにしてた。でも春に真白に出会って気づいた。その気になれば世界は一瞬で色を変える。
And soon after, Sorata ends up at the train station, the place where he first met Mashiro. And it's there that he finally finds her. He rushes to confront her, to bring her home, and then... this fucking scene, man. Just... watch. Man, I don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say. Have you ever heard a voice acting performance that was so good that it gave you chills? Yeah. After all this time, Mashiro had been holding in all this pain and guilt, and to see it all come out is absolutely heartbreaking. Sakurasou is everything to Mashiro. It's where she came to pursue her dream of making manga. It's where she met so many like-minded people. These people being the first to finally treat her like a real person. It's the first place in her life she could properly call home. The first place with people she could call family. She loves Sakurasou. So to see it be destroyed because of her presence, it tore her up inside like nothing else. She doesn't understand why her being there would be the reason for its destruction. So she came to the conclusion that it was because nobody wanted her there. She feels that she's a burden on everyone, a nuisance, and that if she were gone, everything would be fixed. And I know exactly how she feels here. Because I've been there. And Sorata means so much to her. It's clear that Sorata is the person that she looks up to more than anyone else. And I think seeing him act out like he did at the end of episode 21, or throughout episodes 13 and 14, I think that's the thing that hurts her the most. Because all she wants is to see him be happy. I know things have gotten better. I know that Sorata has gotten better. But man, he doesn't deserve Mashiro. There, I said it. And I think that's the last time I'm gonna say it. Because it's not all bad.
だけどそれだけじゃない。俺は真白のおかげで自分の目標を見つけられた。それからは頑張って挑戦して、ダメで悔しくて、そんなの全部ひっくるめて最高の毎日だった。真白に出会わなかったら、こんな気持ち何も知らないままだったんだ。だから俺はそういうことを全部教えてくれた真白のことが好きだ。大好きだ。嫌いなんてなるわけないだろ。だから行くな。
Also, don't worry, she's not gone. She's still here. Mashiro expresses her desire to stay, but she still feels guilty over Sakurasou, as well as the pain that both Sorata and Nanami went through as well. Nanami, who's been skulking behind Sorata this entire time, comes out and tells Mashiro that it's not her fault that she failed her auditions. It's not her burden to bear, but her own. Same goes for Sorata. Even though he likes to blame others for his own misfortune, he's still the only one who should bear the weight of his failure. They reassure Mashiro that she is not at fault for anything, and remind her that she is loved and appreciated for who she is. It is at this moment where she truly realizes just how much she is worth, and what she means to those who are close to her. And despite how different she is, despite the times they come into conflict, despite them not seeing the world in the same way, despite her upbringing and reinforcing the idea that she is not a person, but a tool to be used by others, that idea is just flat out wrong. She is a person. She is human. She is amazing the way she is. And I think here, Sorata puts it best.
真白。
何？
お前桜荘のこと全然分かってないよ。
分かってるわ。
いや分かってない。
分かってる。
俺が言ってる桜荘っていうのはさ、あのボロい建物のことじゃないんだよ。美咲先輩や仁さん、青山や千尋先生、赤坂がいて、それと真白がいるから桜荘なんだ。
空と
みんながいるから桜荘なんだよ。とにかく俺が言いたいのは。
分かったわ。
本当か？
桜荘はみんながいるから桜荘。みんなが桜荘。あ
あ、だから
ずっと桜荘にいるわ。
Well said, man. Well said. I fucking love this show so much. I know it's not perfect. I know that it's super corny and melodramatic. I know that it's a story filled with cliches and tropes. I know that the love triangle romance is lame and that the main character can be a huge asshole. I know, but I love it despite that. Or perhaps even because of all that. Sakurasou is a show that feels like it was made for me. It feels like someone hijacked my brain and gave the information to an AI to create a show that I would feel the most emotional attachment to. Honestly, if I didn't watch K-On! At the time that I did, Sakurasou would probably be my favorite anime of all time. Because despite everything, it's a story that truly had love put into it. It's a story that is truly genuine and is never for a second ashamed of what it is. Even after talking for
1 hour 35 minutes and 11 seconds.
I can't express enough just how much this anime means to me. It's why it took me 2 whole goddamn years for me to make this video. And I'm glad I did. Because there's nothing I love more than sharing something I love with others. If you've come this far, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about an anime I love for this long. Even if you don't agree with me, even if you hate this anime and still don't understand why it resonates with me so much, hell, even if you're still mad at me about that Angel Beats video, I'm happy that you cared enough to watch this video all the way to the end. Because in the grand scheme of things, anime is art, and its main purpose is to inspire people, to express ourselves, to show humanity. I want to one day create something that inspires people, something that means something to someone. If I could create something that means just as much to one person out there as Sakurasou means to me, I would be very happy. But as Kazuki Fujisawa put it, if you cannot move your own heart, you cannot move the hearts of others. As I said before, thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
ねえ、あなたは何色になりたい？